Alright, cool. So we're in meditation 4 today. Let's back up though to the third meditation. Let's review meditation 3. There's a lot going on. Meditation 3 in some ways it's kind of the linchpin of the entire meditations, because if you do not grasp what's going on in meditation 3, nothing else is going to make sense. Because if we look at the overall arch, we got meditation 1, we get deconstruction. And we're left at the end of meditation 1 knowing nothing. Meditation 2, we get a cogito. Got something we can build off of. Meditation 3, we get God, kind of, and we get a couple of principles. So we get a reality principle and a truth principle. Without these two principles and God, nothing else works. Meditation 3 is where everything happens. So we need to do a quick review on this. So, end of meditation 2, we got the cogito, we got the res cogitans that exists while she is thinking. That's all we got. We identify the res cogitans as a thinking thing that is capable of affirmation, denial, wishing, hoping, liking, etc., all these mental states. And then we took a look at Cartesian metaphysics. So the way Descartes thinks the world is composed. And we saw that for Descartes, it's 3 tiers, with one being our most fundamental tier. We have substance at the most fundamental level. Substance is that which is capable of independent existence. So, tablet, marker, cup, you, table, me, cat. All these things can exist independently of one another, right? The existence of my mug has nothing to do with the existence of anything else in this room. Right? The mug just exists independently. But then we have 2 different kinds of substance. We have the finite, and we have the infinite. Finite substances are everything in the world, whereas infinite substance is how Descartes is going to identify God. Remember, we said that it kind of jumps the gun here a little bit with using capital G God, this Abrahamic God, because he ties a whole bunch of modes to God that he has no room to justify as of right now. All he can say is that there's an infinite substance. On top of substance, we have attribute. Throughout the history of philosophy, you more commonly see this referred to as essence. 2 are doing about the same work in Descartes, they're just called by different terms. Attribute is what it is to be a thing of a certain kind. Okay? The quality or the property by which a thing, should it not possess it, could not be a thing of that kind. And we have 2 examples. We have mental things, and we have physical things. The attribute or the essence of mental things is thought, whereas the attribute or essence of physical things is extension. So starting with extension, what it is to be something that is physical is simply to take up space. Okay? If something does not take up space in the world, it's just not a physical object. Now, the amount of space it takes up is inconsequential to its being physical. Atoms are physical. Why? Because they take up space in the world. They take up an incredibly small amount of space, but they take up space. Elephants are physical because they take up space. There's a huge difference in the amount of space taken up by an atom versus an elephant, but they're both physical. And they are, without their ability to take up space in the world, they could not be physical things. By contrast, the attribute of mental things is thought. So we see this most prominently with the res cogitans. The thinking thing, or what the meditator refers to as the I. I am, I think, therefore I am. This first person singular pronoun, this res cogitans. What it is to be a mental thing is to have the ability for thought. This is why the meditator concludes in meditation 2 that she exists insofar as she is thinking. Why? Because thinking is what the res cogitans necessarily does. If it's not thinking, it's just not a thing. And by extension, we don't have any room to say that the res cogitans exists when there's no thought occurring. Why? Because we do not see the principal attribute. Our last bit of Cartesian metaphysics is what Descartes calls mode, or the meditator calls mode. And these are variations, if you will. They are ways in which X can be Y. They are ways in which X can be Y. So with physical things, so we got mental to keep symmetry. And we got physical. With physical things, these are attributes such as color, magnitude, shape, etc., etc. Okay? So both a Rottweiler and a Chihuahua are finite physical substances, so as such their primary attribute is extension, but they vary with regard to their mode, in particular as it refers to magnitude. Okay? By contrast, mental things, the modes of mental things are things such as wishing, willing, affirming. This is non-exhaustive. Denying, etc., etc. Okay? These are ways in which the mind, in this case the res cogitans, displays its principal attribute of thought. So the relationship between mode and attribute is modes or variations upon which the principal attribute can be demonstrated. So the principal attribute of the mind is thought, but thought can be manifested in very different ways. Affirming, denying, wishing, willing, liking, etc., etc. And extension can be manifested in different ways with regard to color, magnitude, shape, etc., etc. From here, let's review objective versus formal reality. So these are different ways in which the meditator conceives of reality. They're the kind of things that were you writing a paper, you really should discuss what these are. So this is the meditator here and Descartes in general serve as what not to do's when writing academic papers, because she just throws these terms around of formal versus objective reality, but never articulates what they mean, and it's incredibly unhelpful. Now granted, these were common philosophical distinctions of the time, but we don't, even in philosophy, we just don't use these distinguishing factors anymore. And in order to understand this, we need to understand the imagination. So the imagination is a faculty, we may say it's a mode of thought. It's a mode of thought, it's a way in which thought can be manifested. Which is referring to the finite substance. that is the res cogitans. So the res cogitans is a finite substance. It necessarily thinks, but a way in which it can think is through imagination, or to imagine. Imagining is a mode of thought. Now, in the early modern period, which the early modern period stems in Europe from, I would say, about 1650 till about, once you kick the bucket, about 1880-ish. This is roughly your early modern period. Okay. Prior to this, you have what's usually called the Age of Enlightenment. And after this, you usually have what's called the modern era. Okay. Prior to Enlightenment, you have the Renaissance. Now, during this early modern period in Western philosophy, imagination is understood very literally. It's understood etymologically. So with imagination, the corresponding object of imagination are ideas. So if we look at this relation, I'm going to put it in its verbal form. To imagine is a verb, whereas ideas are nouns. So the corresponding object of the verb to imagine are ideas. Now this word idea comes from the Greek eidos. Eidos literally means form or shape. Fun. This is where we get our word. It's the Greek word idiotes, which is where we get our word idiot. Idiot is someone without form or shape. The idea behind an idiot is that their mind is completely formless or shapeless. That's what it is to be an idiot. But this idea of the early modern conception of an idea as form or shape is that ideas are necessarily imagistic. So in contemporary philosophy, we tend to think of ideas propositionally, that is with language. So when we say I have an idea in my mind, what we usually mean by that in contemporary thought is that you have a certain proposition, a certain linguistic proposition in your mind. But what it's meant in the early modern period, when one says they have an idea, is not that they have a linguistic proposition, but there's a mental picture in your mind. So when one says in the early modern period, I have an idea of a lion, if we could take a snapshot of their mind, there would be a picture of a lion in there. Okay. This is important to understand so we can get at the distinction between formal versus objective reality. So the formal reality, the easiest way to think of this is as what is going on in an agent's mind. By contrast, the objective reality is what occurs in the external world. I think this is going to turn into just a lecture on meditation 3. We'll do meditation 4 on Friday. That's okay. Meditation 3, you can never have enough of it. It's just so vital. So formal reality is what is occurring in an agent's mind, whereas objective reality is what occurs in the external world. Now think back, think like this early modern period. I say that I have an idea of a lion. So A has an idea of a lion. So their proposition. In the early modern period, we obviously know there's not a lion existing in A's mind, but rather there is a mental picture of a lion in A's mind. Now, this idea had to have come from somewhere. Okay? The meditator notes that there are three different kinds of ideas. There's innate ideas, there's adventitious ideas, and there's compound ideas. Adventitious ideas are ideas that derive from sensory perception. So for example, my idea of a lion would derive from sensory perception. In order for me to have an idea of a lion, I need to have seen a lion. That doesn't mean I need to have seen one in person. I could have seen a picture of one in a book. I could have seen, now I could see one on TV, I could see one in a zoo, whatever. But in order for me to have an idea in this early modern understanding of a lion, I need to have had a perception of it. So perception precedes imagination. These are adventitious ideas. Okay. So for example, this is always a fun example, but in the early modern period in Europe, pineapples were exceedingly rare because they come from the New World and parts of Asia. And pineapples were considered a symbol of wealth and status. So European royalty would have their portraits taken while holding pineapples because it displayed their wealth. One cannot have, so in the early modern period, if I go up to the average citizen or the average subject of the French king and say, do you have an idea of a pineapple? And I begin to explain to them, a pineapple is a piece of fruit that is roughly cylindrical, has a green leaves sticking out of it, kind of like a hat. It's brown, it's somewhat prickly in nature, and inside the fruit is bright yellow and sweet. I can explain all these things to them. But in the early modern period, with their conception of understanding, that person can never have an idea of a pineapple. Why? Because they have not perceived a pineapple. They don't unlock the ability, so to speak, of having an idea of a pineapple until I show them a pineapple. Okay? Or they see a picture of a pineapple. This is what it is to have an adventitious idea. Innate ideas, they're exactly what they sound like. There are ideas that do not derive from sensory perception. They've just always been there. The meditator is going to argue that God is an innate idea. Compound ideas are when we take adventitious ideas and we smush them together. Okay? So for example, one may have a idea of a siren. This is a compound idea. Because all one did was took one's mental picture of a fish, one's mental picture of a woman, and smushed the two together. Okay? So the mind, for the early modern period, is not capable of coming up with new ideas. The mind just does not possess this ability. Ideas have to come from somewhere. They have to come from our senses, or they have to be innate. Okay? So, going back to our proposition here, that A has an idea of a lion, there's two things we can look at. Two ways we can look at the reality of the proposition. We can look at what is going on in the agent's mind, so her mental picture of a lion. This is the formal reality of the lion. Okay? The lion is real in the sense that it exists as an image in the mind of the agent. Okay? By contrast, we know she has to have seen the lion somewhere. This is where she derives her mental image. The lion, as it exists in the external world, is the objective reality. Okay? So the relationship between objective and formal reality is such that it needs to exist in the world so that it can exist in the mind of an agent. And then that agent must perceive what exists in the world so that she can have an idea of it. Okay. Now remember, at this point in meditation 3, we don't have an external world. Okay? There's no ideas of lions going on in meditation 3. Why? Because we don't have reason to believe in any of it yet. But there's one thing the meditator says she does have an idea of. And this is going to be that which moves us from only knowing the cogito to eventually knowing everything that we do now. If we erase this, and we'll go into this argument. So now we're going to get what is called a causal argument. For the existence of God. More importantly, not just for the existence of God, but for the necessary existence of God. What makes that even bolder than just saying it's an argument for the existence of God is because we could understand God as existing either necessarily or as existing contingently. Or we may say accidentally. What it is to exist necessarily is that it could not have been otherwise. So a necessary proposition are mathematic propositions. It just could not be otherwise. Okay? Whereas contingent propositions and accidental propositions are things that could have been otherwise. Okay? So physics. Physics is the study of a whole bunch of contingent propositions because everything there could have been otherwise. It is conceivable that the laws of physics could have been otherwise. Is it probable? No, probably not. I don't know. I'm not a physicist. But it's possible. Whereas with mathematics, it's not even possible that 2 + 2 could equal anything but 4. It's a necessary proposition. So the meditator is going to say, hey, look, the existence of God, this could not have even been otherwise. It is necessary. And here's how our argument starts to work. I have an idea of an infinite substance. The meditator claims that she has an idea of infinite substance. Remember, early modern period, idea has to be imagistic, whatever that means here, but it has to be either adventitious or innate. Well, she's never perceived an infinite substance. At this point in the argument, we don't even have sensory perception, so it has to be innate. So we now have a clarification. I have an innate idea of an infinite substance. Do this.
We have one.
I have an innate idea of an infinite substance. Okay? Well, we have another claim. And remember, I here is very explicitly the res cogitans, am not infinite. This sideways, this little symbol here, that's how we denote negation. Okay, it means not. So I, the res cogitans, am not infinite. Seems pretty indubitable there. I mean, we don't even have a res cogitans that has persistent existence, doesn't exist over time. The res cogitans has to be thinking in order for it to exist. So now the meditator begins to wonder, we have an issue. I have an idea of the infinite. I'm not infinite. But I must have gotten this idea from somewhere. Okay? So, we get a conclusion. Our conclusion here is that there must be an infinite substance. Now, I'm not going to vouch that I rendered this in such a way that it's deductively valid, but it shows the general steps of the argument. So, there must be an infinite substance. But you may be saying to yourself, well, look, slow down, meditator. I see 1, 2, and 3, but there is a huge leap between 3 and the conclusion. We have no reason to jump there yet. And you're right. The meditator doesn't really articulate this well, but we kind of have a latent fourth premise here. Okay, this latent fourth premise is what is called the reality principle. Or this is what we call it. The meditator does not call it this. The reality principle states this is our reality principle. It states there must be at least as much objective reality in the cause as there is formal reality in the effect. So, if we look at it as it relates to this argument at hand, we have a cause, which leads to some effect. In this case, our effect is the innate idea of the infinite, okay, which has a formal reality of, let's just say, x. Well, this idea has to come from somewhere. There's no effect without a cause. That's pretty fundamental metaphysics there. So, because of the reality principle, we need to have some infinite substance. Not an infinite substance that exists in our mind, but an infinite substance that exists out in the world. And the objective reality of this infinite substance must be at least, it must be greater than the formal reality of the effect. Okay. Because were this not the case, then we would have no idea of the effect. This is roughly our argument. Now, there's a lot of places you can object to this argument. There's a lot of places historically this argument does get objections. Honestly, I think the only place that this argument never receives an objection is to that premise. Everyone's like, yeah, that seems reasonable, that I'm not infinite. Or the res cogitans, the thinking thing is not infinite. But this one, we can call into question. I have an idea of an infinite substance, David Hume in the 19th century is going to say, no, you don't. That's ridiculous. What do you mean you have an idea of the infinite? All you do when you say you have an idea of the infinite is you keep adding +1 in your mind. That's not an idea of the infinite. We can object here to the thought I have an innate idea of an infinite substance, so we can retain the objection, the Humean objection of I have an idea of an infinite substance, and then tack on this extra objection of, what do you mean you have an innate idea? There's no such thing as an innate idea. This idea that the mind has ideas in it from birth is just absolutely wild. This idea, though, no pun intended, comes from Plato, in particular, Plato's Meno. In the Meno, Plato articulates a view that says the mind knows, the mind has certain innate ideas. He tries to demonstrate this by asking a slave boy to do to solve a geometric puzzle. Okay. And he says, look, the slave can do some geometry. Surely this is a sign that there are innate ideas in the mind. This is where we get this idea of Socratic teaching, because if you read that portion of the Meno, Socrates asked the slave the most leading questions imaginable, that the slave just kind of gets those questions right because they're pretty obvious questions, the way Socrates articulates them. So we can certainly object to this. This one, the reality principle. This one gets a lot of flack. Okay? There's room to object here to say that this principle as a whole makes no sense. The easiest way to reject this principle is to try to come up with a counterexample. If one can come up with a counterexample, then it's gone. Now, as thin or as frail as the argument may seem, the meditator gets a lot of mileage out of this argument. Because it is from this argument that now our world, our Cartesian world, so I'm going to call it CW, the Cartesian world, has two citizens in it. We have the res cogitans. We have ourselves as the res cogitans. We don't know if we have other people in there yet. So far, we're solipsistic. So we get the res cogitans, but we also got an infinite substance. I'm not going to say that we have God, because the meditator very clearly oversteps here. Because by God, and she says this, I mean a substance that is omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent, and cause of all things. We need an omni word for that one. I could say omnigenetic. It's the cause of everything. Note, while these modes, to use the lingo of the day, these modes may be something that we need to attribute to the infinite substance, the meditator doesn't have room to do that yet. Okay? So the meditator doesn't have God, so necessarily, rather what she has is the existence of an infinite substance. Okay? But nevertheless, we got more in this world than we had at the end of meditation 2. The last thing we need to review, the next time we'll do meditation 4, is what gets to be called, or sometimes is called, the truth principle. And it refers to clear and distinct perceptions. And the meditator articulates this. If A can clearly and distinctly perceive X, then X must be true. So if A is some agent, can clearly and distinctly perceive X, where X is something, then X, the thing, must be true. We don't get a good articulation of what she has in mind by the truth principle, but she does give us an example, or latently gives an example. The cogito. The cogito is supposed to serve as our paradigmatic example of the truth principle. Because she says in Meditation 2 something to the effect of, look, even when I undo all my knowledge like I did in Meditation 1, I can't undo this. I can't undo cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. So this is perceived clearly and distinctly. And as such, it must be true. Now, we can ask ourselves, what is the relationship between the truth principle and the reality principle? Because she seems to think the two are related, but something we can do another day. What I will say right now is, I'm going to just call it C and D, for clear and distinct, is not the same as that which is known by the light of nature. She's going to use this phrase, and a reader can get very easily tripped up and think that clear and distinct perceptions are those that are known by the light of nature. The two are distinct. Okay? She does not give any good articulation of what it is to be known by the light of nature, but she does draw some kind of distinction between these two. What that is, that's something we can discuss another day. So today turned into a Meditation 3 recap / just lecture 2.0. I don't think that's a bad thing. Once again, this is kind of the crux of the entire meditations. On Friday, in lieu of discussion, we will do Meditation 4. Because in Meditation 4, the meditator is going to give us more things that we know. And we're going to see where error comes in from. Meditation 4 is sometimes referred to as theodicy, or Descartes' theodicy. It comes from the Greek words theos and dike, and it's an account of divine justice. In this case, it's an account of where does error come from? Because remember, we got a res cogitans and we got an infinite substance, aka God. How are we making mistakes? That's what Meditation 4 deals with, is where do mistakes come from? Okay, and she's very broadly going to say mistakes are a source or caused by the will, not by the intellect. The intellect cannot make mistakes, but the will can make mistakes. But we'll get to that on Friday. Pause it there.